The year is 1960. Gas is 31 cents a gallon. A junior senator from Massachusetts named John Kennedy is taking the country by storm, and Arnold Palmer is having one of the greatest seasons in golf history. By July 31st, the 30-year-old Palmer's won 6 tournaments, including the year's first 2 majors, the Masters and the US Open. It's not his coming out party. He had once before taken the green jacket and led the PGA Tour's money list in 1958, but it's a massive step towards the Titans of yesteryear. Palmer's season, though, is defined as much by what lays ahead as what lay behind. Unlike almost all of his contemporaries, he's decided to cross the pond to enter the British Open for the very first time. For over 2 decades, the sport's best American players had been dodging the invitation, with very few exceptions, due to its high travel costs and frequently conflicting dates with the better-paying PGA Championship. But Palmer wants to buck the trend. Palmer wants to run down the living legend Ben Hogan, who'd won a Triple Crown of his own in 1953. In fact, Palmer wants to one-up him. Hogan's Triple Crown was limited to 3 by scheduling conflict with the PGA Championship, but Palmer can play it with ease 2 weeks later. There's nothing stopping him from going for 4, like the great Bobby Jones. As the story goes, that was how the modern Grand Slam, and thus the modern majors, got their rock-solid designations. On a flight across the Atlantic, opining to journalist Bob Drum about the shame that was the death of the traditional Grand Slam, Palmer suggested that the Masters, US Open, Open Championship, and PGA Championship be dubbed the new Grand Slam. He was golf's most popular player, with the cult-like backing of Arnie's Army, and Drum was among its most powerful voices. Surely they could make it a thing while he tried to run it down. Except that's not how it happened. It's a great story, and not entirely apocryphal, I'm sure, but mention of Arnie's Grand Slam chances predated his conversation with Drum by months. The earliest mention, an AP article promoting his pursuit, was sent over the wire in April after he won at Augusta, not in June or July after his triumph at Cherry Hills. Why then does Palmer's story persist? It helps that he's one of the greatest players and biggest personalities to ever swing a club, that Arnie's Army still walks among us in force today. But really, it's because the truth is never so convenient. See, major championships for much of golf's history were far more fluid than we accept them to be today. Well, for much of golf's history, they didn't exist at all. For half a millennium or more, the game was played by aristocracy for recreation, not for titles or for glory. There's mention of open tournaments at Leith and St. Andrews in the mid-18th century, following the dawn of the golf club, but those quickly came to be members-only championships, effectively yet more recreational days out, rather than legitimate competitive enterprises. Various moneyed men took on that mantle, sporadically offering prizes for one-off tournaments, but they too failed to move the needle. The only way to be a golf professional in any modern sense was to work around the game, caddy, teach, make equipment, or, more scandalously, wager on your matches. It does sound a little silly because of how we play the game, but that was the competitive scene in which those of the lower and middle classes could partake. It was a lot like a combat sport. You called someone out, threw down the gauntlet, met in a neutral location, and made the match. A number of mostly St. Andrews-based golfers rose to the top of this still very niche world by word of mouth. Old Tom Morris, Andrew Strath, and Willie Parks Sr., but the cream of the crop was Allen Robertson. The 3rd generation of a golf equipment manufacturing family, Robertson had the game in his blood and made very good use of it. Some go so far as to claim he never lost a competitive game in his entire life, though it's hard to read that as more than fantasy. Regardless, he was indisputably the best player in the world in the mid-19th century. He even played a 20-round world championship of sorts against Willie Dunn, the best player in the world before him, to prove it. As Robertson laid waste to the world of moderately professional golf, club championships between the upper class were intensifying. In 1857, on the insistence of Major James Ogilvie Fairley of Prestwick Golf Club, a Grand National Championship of Scotland was called. A match play meeting of all the club's best players, it was relatively familiar to the modern eye. In 1858, it got even closer as they shifted to individual match play, and in 1859, it became a modern stroke play tournament. Then Robertson died, without having a natural successor. Now having perfectly good infrastructure and 3 years' worth of kinks worked out with the Grand National Championship, Fairley figured they could host a similar tournament for professional golfers too. At the insistence of their members, the clubs opened up this tournament to amateurs the following year, and thus was born the Open Championship. It was a major championship because it was the only championship. It was the World Championship. That's why it's the Open, after all. Over the years, the amateur golfers slipped further and further down the board as equipment improved and social attitudes towards professionalism in sport began to shift. By the mid-1870s, they had practically disappeared altogether from open contention. The genteel amateurs could not abide by this. They embodied the game, unsullied by the perversions of money, as its stewards intended it. They were the ones being wronged by the gambling, drinking, hard-living lower-class rabble. Class politics is always complicated, but it was much less so in those days. The wealthy were in charge. They ran the clubs, they ran the R&A, so they brought their own tournament back. In 1885, the clubs hosted an unofficial amateur championship at Royal Liverpool, and in 1886, it officially became the Amateur Championship. That was a major championship too. Amateur sport in those days was often equal to its professional counterparts, in reputation at least, and golf was no different, especially with their peers, classmates, neighbors, and friends running the R&A and the media. It only stands to reason, then, that the amateur edition occupies the same pedestal. One for pros and one for amateurs should have been enough, though, right? Well, sort of. It certainly would have been enough at the time, but as the Industrial Revolution rolled on, time was moving faster than ever. Aboard brand new steamships, more goods were moving, more ideas were moving, and critically, more people were moving, especially to the United States. The rapid ascension of commercial travel and a series of huge immigration spikes made it a near certain eventuality that the new-look golf would come to America's Scottish community. On the early returns, though, it seemed they didn't care. We know the game made its way to America through several ports, reaching West Virginia, Nebraska, and untold other places along the way that have surely been lost to time, but it all faded. It wasn't for over a quarter century after the first playing of the Open that anyone managed to assert its presence with any permanence. Frequently away on business to his native Scotland and northern England, both areas ripe with textile mills, Scottish-American linen merchant Robert Lockhart was quite familiar with the Royal Scottish game. But it wasn't really his game. Until 1887. On a trip back to his native Dunfermline, Lockhart went all in, helping to found the Dunfermline Golf Club, and thought surely it was something that his friends back in the States, many of whom were Scots themselves, would love. He wasn't a man of half measures, though. If he was going to back something, he was going to go big. He diverted his trip from Dunfermline to St. Andrews to see old Tom Morris, perhaps the finest equipment maker in the world, and placed an order for a set of his highest-end balls and clubs. So golf's destiny was written. His friends fell in love with the game. He had to immediately write Morris for 5 more sets of clubs. They had temporary courses in parks, pastures, and orchards. Businessman John Reed was so enthralled by the sport that he founded a permanent home, St. Andrews Golf Club, with Lockhart in Yonkers the very next year. While it wasn't the first, having been pipped by a short-lived group of Scotsmen in West Virginia in 1884, it was the first that would endure. Accessibly placed for both New York's rich and America's largest immigrant community, member Andrew Carnegie embodying both, the club boomed. And powered by several other mostly Scot-backed clubs, the game boomed. Chicago, founded by Scots. Newport, Shinnecock, and the Country Club, designed or run by Scots. After an argument over who was allowed to crown a national amateur champion, they met in New York in 1894 and formed the USGA at the prodding of a Scot. Knowing how things eventually broke in Scotland, however, they opted for open and amateur divisions from the start, and thus were born the next two major tournaments. A pair of New World tournaments and a pair of Old World tournaments, split by professional status on either side. Perfect balance found at last. Right? Right? Again, history is not so convenient. It was briefly a state of perfect balance, certainly. In fact, some would claim these were the only four majors for another half-century, but dissenting voices and struggles for power quickly destabilized the existing order. Struggles for power that were, in fairness, quite characteristic of the day. See, in the U.S., as in any country, there had long been regional division, but the increasing land area of the states, their cultural idiosyncrasies, and the relative isolation of the 19th century took it to another level. They had just finished fighting a regional civil war not 30 years prior, after all, something Scotland hadn't seen in generations. The USGA's centralized control over the sport then represented a significant threat to golf in the United States, one that quickly came to pass. The clubs of the Midwest, then just referred to as the West, felt that the USGA, being based in New York, was growing subservient to its East Coast members. Even the founding members at the Chicago Golf Club felt that their needs were being bypassed in favor of their peers. That opened a window. Opportunists in the Windy City thought that it presented the perfect chance to control their own destiny, for self-determination, so they called a meeting of Chicago's clubs and formed their own governing body, the Western Golf Association. Considering their geographic scope, reaching 500 miles from Chicago in any direction, they too wanted their own events, and they had the money to put them on. In 1899, 1 week before the U.S. Open, for the sake of efficiency, they hosted the inaugural Western Open. Though it floundered through the early years, the tournament became a staple of the golfing calendar. All the best players that would be at the U.S. Open were there. The prize money was comparable, and at that point, it had a similar stage. Some would disagree, even to this day, but it was major too. It's a little more complicated than the others, sure. In truth, occupying a space like the PGA now as a best-of-the-rest type major, but that's still a major. Now we're up to 5. Surely that's as high as it could possibly go. About that. If you use those criteria to define the Western Open as a major, then surely they must also be applied to the North and South. Sometimes referred to as the Masters before the Masters, it was a single-venue tournament that anchored the early days of Pinehurst's golf operation. Actually, it was the early days of Pinehurst's golf operation. Before it became a golf resort, it was simply a health resort, an escape from the pre-regulation sanitary conditions of New York City. And the influx of top pros gave it a reputation beyond that, one that still exists today. It was a symbiotic relationship, of course. Though the prize money was just fine, and the course was just fine, especially before the days of number 1, what really attracted the game's best was the clientele. The players would come to Pinehurst, stay a few weeks on the resort's dime, and give high-dollar lessons, still their primary source of income, to the Northeast's mega-rich. Their presence was such a notable event around it that the North and South became one of the biggest tournaments of the day. 6, though, is where we reach equilibrium, if only for a little while. 2 for Britain, 2 for North America, and 2 minor majors. For the next decade, as golf embedded itself around the world, especially the Anglosphere, this was the operating condition. Several tournaments popped up of varying repute and accessibility, the Canadian, Metropolitan, and Massachusetts Opens all standing out, but none, in retrospect, carried the full weight of the others. Scottish players still played this era largely uncontested, but everyone was starting to get a larger piece of the pie as the tournament scene expanded and evangelized their beloved game more effectively than they could have ever imagined. By 1904, they had so many entrances to the U.S. Open that they had to add a cut line. By 1910, the USGA's membership had increased 15 times over. Businessmen were playing the game. Athletes were playing the game. A native-born American won a major. It was only a matter of time before the ball started rolling again. Like in Chicago, it was another case of pure American opportunism that set us in motion. Department store magnate Rodman Wanamaker had noticed that his golf business, which generally served a clientele that could be reliable customers in his stores, was slowing down. Slowing down because of a surge at rival retailer A.G. Spalding. It was a war he was desperate not to lose. Spalding had already monopolized so much of the sporting market that golf was practically the only game where he had a leg up. Educated as he was, though, the changing market conditions were far beyond his purview. Enter Tom McNamara. McNamara, whose family name was the name in Irish golf for a time, was head professional at Siwanoy Country Club, 3 times runner-up at the U.S. Open, and Wanamaker's secret weapon as head of golf sales, a job for which he had revolutionary ideas. McNamara figured that if they truly wanted to strike a blow to Spalding, they needed to think much, much beyond simple imports and exports. In his eyes, what would be good for golf's gander would be good for Wanamaker's goose. With near limitless backing, he wanted to catapult golf into America's recreational mainstream by supercharging the professional game, maybe kicking business back to Wanamaker through his association with the top pros along the way. And he got the green light. In January of 1916, McNamara rounded up 60 of golf's biggest movers and shakers, including 35 A-tier pros, for an exploratory meeting in New York City. Wanamaker, critically, had no interest in the sport himself, so McNamara had the leeway to steer the birth of professional golf through the choppy waters of its infancy. Under his guidance, the men agreed to form a united organizing body for professional players in the United States, the PGA of America, independent of the USGA, that would serve their interests. A golf pros union almost. It was only agreed conditionally, though. They had seen how badly the early days of the USGA went, and were quite comfortable maintaining the status quo with their metropolitan equivalents. But Wanamaker brought out a mighty big carrot. In addition to forming the PGA, they would also create a well-paying championship for PGA professionals, generously and entirely funded by Wanamaker. So then there was the PGA Championship. It was a little odd being a match play event, and quickly cut ties with Wanamaker himself, unwilling to be beholden to one specific supplier, but it caught on. The Wanamaker Trophy was highly coveted before it was briefly lost in the 20s, and being PGA champion was a huge honor. It, too, was major. I know 7 just seems excessive, but clarity is coming. Heck, at this point, you could even throw in the news of the world back in England and make it 8. But given how severely the war crippled the event, and that it never quite recovered its mystique after the Great Triumvirate aged out, we'll leave it on the fringes with the Canadian and Metropolitan. For most of the teens and 20s, especially in the United States where it was largely unaffected by the war, golf plodded along as it was. A new generation of stars, Hagen, Sarazen, and Jones, America's answer to the Great Triumvirate, kept the game on its path of exponential growth. Crowds, purses, and attention all ballooned to never-before-seen levels as the men dueled it out week to week, even following them overseas as they headlined a decade of American dominance in the Open. None of their adoring fans knew, however, that one of them would act as the sport's great filter, as a human dividing line between the past and the present. That he would accomplish something so significant that you could actually measure the entire game by his resume. A second-generation lawyer educated at Georgia Tech, Harvard, and Emory, Bobby Jones was golf's last great amateur. Like much of the Southern aristocracy of the day, he turned his nose up at the professional game. It was beneath his social standing at a time and place where that was all important, where it's still quite important in a way that doesn't exist across much of the country. He played at Georgia Tech, he played in his spare time, but he was a lawyer. That was the path that was laid out for him from birth, and that was the path that he wanted to take. Being a professional golfer was not glamorous, it was hard work and poorly compensated. Many of the day's finest pros died destitute, with not a thing to their name. Make no mistake, though, he was a serious player. At just 14, he won the Georgia Am and reached the quarterfinals of the US Am. The next year, he won the Southern Am. At 18, he qualified for the US Open for the first time. And at 20, right after graduating from Georgia Tech, his career launched into the stratosphere. He had been in and around the action before that, but the 1922 US Open was different. He followed up a disappointing first round with back-to-back days near the top of the field to give him control of his own destiny on Sunday. A round of historic brilliance from fellow 20-year-old Gene Sarazen would see him beaten to the title in the end, but there was no doubt he had arrived among the elite that weekend in Illinois. Jones went on to light up the Open and amateur major tournaments over the next decade, but only attempted all four in 1921 and 1926, a sign perhaps of his fractious relationship with the UK dating back to a legendary meltdown he had at St. Andrews as a teen. One he did overcome in the end in that 1926 season, winning the Claret Jug on the old course that had so tormented him 5 years prior. Eventually, though, the schedule became too much. He had joined his father's law office in 1928, and his work commitments were more and more difficult to play around. In 1928, he entered neither the Open as its back-to-back champion nor the British Am. Same story in 29. Seeing his career slipping away and not wanting to overstay his welcome in the game, Bobby set out in 1930 on his farewell tour and one last run for the clean sweep. He was so confident in squeezing out every last bit of his golf talent that he bet $1,200, nearly $23,000 today, on himself to sweep the lot. And he was right to be confident. The Open at Royal Liverpool, the British Am at St. Andrews, the US Open at Interlaken, and the US Am at Marion all fell to the young Georgian. At the third time of asking, he secured the impregnable quadrilateral of golf, the Grand Slam. All of a sudden, a line in the sand was drawn. The tagline Grand Slam was so influential that the other major tournaments were relegated to secondary status in retrospect. Over time, the sport's leaders agreed that the original majors, for record-keeping purposes, would be the four bases of Bobby Jones' Grand Slam. It would be hard for that to define the future, though. As mentioned, Jones was golf's last great amateur. Only one playing of the US or British Open has been won by an amateur in the 95 years since. Further, the world of golf was rapidly drifting apart. As the impacts of the Depression grew more and more severe, American players stopped crossing the pond to play the Open, and European players missed their chance to start coming the other way. The Slam, then, was dead the day it was born. There were mentions of a professional Grand Slam, as the tournament seemed formalized through the 30s, but nobody had ever managed to pin it down in the way Jones had. Byron Nelson claimed that in my time, the four major championships were the US Open, the PGA, the Western, and the North and South, but others still insisted the Canadian or Metropolitan Opens also belonged. Gradually, as Jones' 1930 season drifted further and further into the rearview, and some clever marketing tricks flipped the table, the concept began to grow into something we would recognize today. In 1939, the floundering Augusta National Invitational, searching for a lifeline, was renamed the Masters and handed over its ticket operation to a local businessman who doubled their waning attendance in 1 year. They still weren't selling it out, but it was a step in the right direction. Owing to these efforts, and certainly to their association with Bobby Jones, when Craig Wood opened the season on a hot streak in 1941, golf media mentioned the Masters alongside the US Open and the PGA in the new three-leg Grand Slam instead of the Western or the North and South. And they did it again for Sam Snead in 1949, and again for Ben Hogan in 53. By the end of the 1950s, it was common parlance among them that those were the big three events. Whether it was the proliferation of broadcasting or simple repetition, something had changed that gave it a sense of permanence. All it needed to make the mainstream was a face. Now we come back to 1960. Arnold Palmer, the most famous man in golf, makes it known that he's going to try the Open this year. He has the stones to go out and win the Masters, knowing the stir he's about to cause. He plays up the plan to a couple of journalists in Augusta. They write it into existence. He wins the US Open. He takes it international. By the time he's finished runner-up at St. Andrews, it's been written and said so many times by so many of golf's most trusted voices across the globe that it might as well have been etched in stone. It wasn't a spur-of-the-moment conversation on a plane, though that makes for a nice story. It was a plan carefully executed by a man as gifted at public relations as he was at golf. One that played on the century of history that unfolded before it. Did he invent the majors? Perhaps he thought he did, but no. His cosign did change them forever, though. Perhaps that's just as important.